Hi there, my name's Chris Rogers, and I'm the supply chain analyst at S&P Global Market Intelligence's Panjiva business unit. I'm going to be talking to you today about the outlook for supply chains in the rest of 2021 under the title Fallout. What do we mean by fallout? Well, a lot of the challenges faced by supply chains today are being driven by the result of a series of decisions that have been made by governments and corporations over the past 5 years. I'm going to talk to you about four main topic areas. I'm going to talk to you about the recovery of supply chains in the wake of the pandemic. I'm going to talk to you about the importance of supply chains in medical supplies and particularly vaccinations. We'll then talk a little bit about the geopolitical rivalries that are characterizing trade policy and their impact on supply chains in the rest of this year. And then we'll talk about the corporations, what they've been doing, and also, more importantly, some of the issues that have been going on in logistics, which I think are going to be a significant issue during the remainder of this year. Looking at the recovery in global trade activity, you can see the chart on the right here. The light blue line shows you global exports, and those have recovered significantly since the depths of the pandemic, and they're also well above the same levels that they were at, similar levels that they were at in 2019. What's been happening there, as I'll talk about in more detail later, is an increase in consumer demand during the stay-at-home period. But importantly, we've also seen a recovery in manufacturing demand, and that's driven a lot of the congestion in supply chains that we're seeing at the moment. Thinking first about vaccinations and the supply chains for those doses, we've seen quite a slow rollout to the COVAX program. And that's been driven by a lot of different factors. But one of the biggest ones that we're suffering from right now is the decision by the Indian government to withhold exports of vaccines until the end of this year. That's put a major dent in COVAX, which the Chinese and Russian manufacturers have been trying to fill. But also increasingly, we'll start to see exports from the G7 countries and hopefully more widely the G20 during the remainder of this year. But we're certainly not going to get to full levels of vaccines across Asia or globally in the remainder of this year. The chart on the left here is showing you the rollout of vaccines in Mexico in terms of the imports of those vaccines. We've seen a tick up since the beginning of the year and a recent peak in May as imports of vaccines, particularly those associated with AstraZeneca, have gotten underway. That's a good sign that the US commitments on distributing vaccines are getting underway. The chart on the right, in the meantime, is showing you exports from the US of pharmaceutical ingredients, many of which are used in vaccines, and supplies to India ramped up quite significantly in the first quarter, but have begun to fall back more recently. Our concern at this stage is that we might begin to see a new round of medical protectionism that could begin to put the vaccine rollout into some doubt during the remainder of this year. If we think about some of the fallout from the geopolitical rivalries that we've seen, obviously the defining one has been relations between the US and China. One of the things that we saw just over a year ago, just before the pandemic, was the signing of the Phase 1 trade deal between the US and China. That was very much designed to bring peace between the two, and was the main feature of that was the significant purchases of US exports that the Chinese government committed to. In the chart on the right, you can see the black line, which shows you the level of exports of those Phase 1 products across energy, agriculture, and manufactured goods, and how those have tipped up significantly since their depths of 2018 and 2019. And they are well above the same levels of 2017. However, they're a long way behind, and in fact, they're only around half of the level that China had committed to. Now, whilst we've been through the pandemic and a lower oil price, we're at a situation now where demand in China has increased and where commodity prices have increased, which I'll talk about a bit later on. As a consequence of which, when we do finally have discussions about the state of the Phase 1 trade deal, they're likely to be contentious. We were supposed to have negotiations between the US and China in February of this year. Those have yet to happen. Another round is scheduled for August. So far, we haven't seen any firm comments from either side that those talks will even happen. And in the meantime, we're beginning to see new areas of friction between the two countries. So we think that the continuation of the phase one trade deal into 2022 looks very unlikely at this stage, and that will have a significant impact potentially on US exporters. In the meantime, the Biden administration appears to be showing no sign of wanting to remove the tariffs that are in place on imports from China that were applied under the Section 301 program. If anything, we might see a reversal of that if tensions continue to rise between the two countries. The chart on the right, in terms of the coloured bars, is showing you the imports to the US of products covered by the Section 301 program. And you can see those have been largely successful in driving down imports. However, those tariffs, which in aggregate are very nearly at $100 billion since they were applied in 2018 in terms of total income, that's all been paid for by US consumers and US companies. And the question the administration will need to ask itself is whether it's worth maintaining the tariff pressure on China at the expense of increased costs for the US. And obviously, as we go through a period of rising inflation, which I'll talk about later on, that may become more of an issue. But remember, the rivalry between the US and China is not about trade. It's more strategic. It's about technology, it's about military development, and it's about values. And as a consequence of which, no amount of simple fixes to a trade deal or to tariffs are going to resolve those tensions and what they really mean for supply chain operators. And indeed, just recently, we've seen the state, Treasury, and Commerce departments of the US issue a new warning to US businesses that are operating in Hong Kong. And as we'll talk about later on, we're also seeing ongoing controversy around the issues of manufacturing in the Xinjiang region of China. The US, in the meantime, has been building a coalition across the region, both in Asia and in Europe, to tackle China's rise, both economically and technologically. And I think we'll see more on that during the rest of this year as well. As a sidebar, the US has a long laundry list of other trade issues to deal with. Trade Promotion Authority has lapsed. That's basically the rules that allow the Biden administration to negotiate trade deals and have them passed in a very simple way by Congress. That's lapsed, so that really reduces, I think, the chances of the US joining CPTPP, certainly this year. The Generalized System of Preferences and the Miscellaneous Tariff Bill are areas that are meant to reduce the tariff loading on US companies, particularly in terms of their purchases from developing economies, including those in Asia. Those have not been renewed, although there is bipartisan pressure to do so. We may see resolution there during this year as well. And then we have the Section 232 duties, particularly on steel and aluminum. Those are still in place. The administration may remove them from imports from the EU and UK during the rest of this year, but we wouldn't expect to see that happen for imports from Asia. Looking in the rest of the world, trade policy rivalries are continuing to have an impact on supply chains. In the UK and Europe, that's being driven by the controversy following Brexit about trade between Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the mainland of the United Kingdom. That is supposed to be resolved by September 30th, but as we've seen before, the series of brinkmanship can lead to significant uncertainties for supply chain operators. There's also globally a lot of areas of uncertainty, few of which unfortunately are going to be resolved this year. At the WTO level, we're still waiting for a resolution to the challenges faced by dispute settlement. A deal on fisheries, which may be close and may be agreed by November, will be important in showing whether the WTO can even get long-term deals done. We've also got membership of CPTPP and RCEP, which certainly in terms of CPTPP, there are expectations that that may be expanded. As I mentioned earlier, the US is unlikely to join. We may even see China begin to come into that as well. One of the emerging issues that you need to watch as well is the EU's Fit for 55 climate programme. That includes a carbon adjustable border mechanism that will effectively act as a tariff on imports across a small range of industries initially. That will act as a tariff on those industries for imports from countries that don't have significant carbon trading programs. So far, really only China in the Asia region has got a nationwide system that might avoid those new EU rules. taking a look at the operation of supply chains and the concerns we've had for some time about the relatively short-term approach that a lot of corporations have been taking in their supply chain planning. Supply chains can be characterized as having short-term fluctuations in demand, but long-term challenges in terms of adapting, in terms of either adding capacity or in terms of shifting where supply chains operate from. And we've seen really a prime example of that in the retail sector, where we've seen a significant surge in consumer demand during the pandemic for stay-at-home type products. That's perhaps best illustrated by the chart on the right, which shows US seaborne imports of consumer discretionary products on over the first 5 months of this year compared to the same period of 2019. And that's showing you double-digit gains across most product areas. Areas that have lagged are those that have had very specific issues. So in consumer electronics, for example, we may be beginning to see saturation, but we've also seen the challenges around semiconductors, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We've also seen a slowdown, and in fact, more recently, a reversal in activity in textiles and apparel. That's been driven partly on the demand side by the timing of the back-to-school period in the US, but it's also potentially going to be driven by the challenges being seen in employment, most recently in Vietnam, where a number of factories, for example, including those supplying Nike, have had to close because of a shortage of staff. Now, the issues that we've seen in retail really have driven inventories a long way down. What we haven't seen so far, though, are companies beginning to talk about how they're going to react to that in terms of their supply chain planning going forward. Now, whilst I've talked about that in relevance to retail, it's been particularly an issue in the automotive sector. As a quick reminder, the auto sector has faced a number of constraints in manufacturing during the first half of 2021 because of a shortage of semiconductors. And that was driven by a very short-term approach to supply chain planning during the pandemic downturn last year, where effectively the car companies rescinded a lot of their longer-term contracts, and that led the semiconductor manufacturers to prioritize other industries. What we've seen since then is that the automakers have not been able to secure the semiconductors that they need, and that's had a knock-on effect throughout their supply chains. The chart on the right here is showing you the shipments into Mexico of automotive components in 2021 versus 2019. And you can see for many companies, particularly Ford and also Volkswagen, just how deep that downturn has been. Other companies are beginning to recover, but only slowly. What we'll need to see from companies during the rest of this year is an answer to, on a go forward basis, do you continue with just-in-time planning and accept the risks that are associated with that? Or do you move to a more precautionary principle, which maybe costs more, but reduces your risk premium in the meantime? As I say, so far, most companies have yet to start talking about those policies, and that's something we look forward to seeing throughout the current and future conference call seasons. One of the factors that we see when you put together rising demand along with supply chain constraints is a significant amount of inflation. The chart on the right here is showing you a basket of different supply chain commodities, ranging from metals to plastics and including shipping rates on a sequential basis. And you can see throughout 2021, we've seen a continued uptick in most of these inflation rates. Now, it's worth bearing in mind a lot of these will take several months to feed through into consumer pricing. In fact, most companies are now talking about price increases. We used an analysis of company conference calls using S&P Global's textual data analytics suite, and that showed us that the proportion of companies talking about inflation in the second quarter of this year was the highest it's been since 2011. So price increases very much underway. Again, because companies have taken a short-term approach to their planning, that's meant that they've had to react to the shifting supply chain inflation with short-term pricing. And it remains to be seen whether that's going to lead to a shift in market share within the different industries that are exposed to these products during the rest of this year. In fact, it's become so important as an issue that we've started to see government intervention. For example, the Biden administration's actions on the executive order to do with competition, and also the potential for subsidies for semiconductors. So again, those issues may force companies to start thinking about their long-term planning. An issue I talked about earlier that's become a complication for supply chains, and I think will become more challenging in the rest of this year, are issues around forced labor. This isn't just a China issue. This has also been an issue for supplies of rubber gloves, for example, from Malaysia, which are shown for the company Top Glove on the right. But the increased use of things like withhold release orders and the entity list, as it's called, I think is going to force companies to think increasingly about their supply chains in depth. And in fact, we saw Uniqlo, the retailer owned by Fast Retailing, get into some issues there with their sourcing earlier in the year. And we'd expect to see more of the same during the rest of this year. A bigger issue that we've seen, and one that is less easy to deal with, is underinvestment in the logistics sector. We've seen demand really be sustained for much longer than expected. The chart on the right here, again, is comparing to 2019, looking at US seaborne imports by port. And the level of shipments into the ports has remained elevated throughout June. We've not just seen a lot more demand, we've also seen a great deal of congestion events. So the blockage of the Suez Canal, the closure of the port at Yanshan because of a shortage of staff. We've seen a number of vessel fires, including the Express Pearl. We've got the ongoing storm season to deal with, and even just simple issues around vessels colliding with docks that can lead to significant knock-on effects. The logistics industry has done an incredible job during the pandemic of keeping goods flowing, but we might be beginning to see the toll of that in terms of the operating risks within supply chains. Straightening out that issue with new vessel orders is going to take, frankly put, years to deliver. A lot of orders have been put in for new vessels, but those are going to really only be delivered in 2023 and 2024. And we may therefore see another round of boom and bust in the shipping industry. We are seeing a lot more capital being invested in the logistics industry, and we've seen a significant uptick, particularly investments for technology solutions on the freight forwarding side, as the industry seeks to really capitalize on the opportunity presented by the higher profits that logistics are making right now. But these challenges, I think, are going to continue throughout the third quarter, and a fix will only come in the longer term. Another issue for the logistics industry, and more broadly for supply chains, is the rise of the so-called supply chain attack in the cybersecurity sphere. The chart that's on the right here is just a simple measure of the number of attacks on a normalized basis, industry by industry, using data from BitSight, which is available on the S&P Global Data Marketplace. The top line that you see there, the dark blue, is transport and logistics, where we've seen a significant uptick in the number of attacks on the sector. And remember, that follows some fairly landmark attacks on companies like Maersk and TNT just a couple of years ago. Clearly, the impact of a cyber attack in logistics can have a knock-on effect throughout supply chains. And again, this is an area that's receiving a lot more government interest. So to pull it all together, we've seen throughout 2021 the fallout from a series of supply chain decisions that were made by governments and corporations over the past 5 years. It's led to disruptions that are happening right now, and those are only going to unwind very slowly during the remainder of this year. So the message for supply chains this year is continuing congestion, slow to recover, and watch the emergence of new government policies and new company statements on their supply chain strategies. So let's take a few questions. We have a few minutes here. If you want to enter questions as well, you can do that through the widget, and I'll try to get to them. And if not, we'll be writing up some follow-up research that you'll be able to get via panjiva.com to find out more. So first question here, when will the shortage of semiconductors clear, and what does that mean for the automakers? Well, there's a lot there. What we've really seen in terms of expectations for clearance of issues around the pandemic more broadly, so not just semiconductors, but all of the other changes, is there's this almost kind of T plus 6 months effect going on. So when all of these issues started about 18 months ago, it was a view, well, we'll be done by the summer, and then we'll be done by the autumn, and then we'll be done by the winter. And it's kind of very much rolled on from there. And that's kind of the situation we still seem to be in. And we've had commentary from a lot of major companies across the logistics industry and the tech industry and the autos industry, basically saying, look, it's going to be sometime next year, so sometime in 2022. I think just to kind of dig into that in a little bit more detail, we're still seeing automakers pushing back their production, blaming. So in the case of General Motors, for example, has been the most recent, temporary parts shortages caused by semiconductor supply constraints. Now, the issue here really isn't the availability of semiconductors in the aggregate. In fact, we've continued to see an increase in availability of some semiconductors. So if you look at the exports from Taiwan, mainland China, Japan and South Korea, those actually increased by around 10% in June versus May. So they're trending upwards. But clearly it's the wrong sort of chips in the wrong sort of place at the wrong sort of time. Again, we've had commentary from some of the chip makers to the effect that there is growth, but it's going to be a tight capacity situation until next year. TSMC, for example, have said that, as have Intel. So, why is it going to take so long to clear? Well, the first thing is that we do still have elevated demand for electronics across the board. And until that dissipates, and that's very much a question for the economists, until that consumer demand dissipates, we're still going to see elevated requirements for chips of all sorts. The second part is really going to involve this question as to whether we're going to get incremental investment in new semiconductor manufacturing capacity. One of the things that we've seen during the pandemic and more recently is an unwillingness by a lot of manufacturers across the board, not just in semiconductors, to respond to what is seen as being a short-term demand signal with an investment in long-term factory capacity. And so, we haven't seen that supply response. We may begin to see it, though, because there's a lot more in the way of government incentives being made available than there were in the past. So, for example, the moves by the Biden administration I mentioned earlier to incentivize manufacturing. So, in general terms, we're looking at 2022 for a recovery in semiconductor availability and therefore a normalization of conditions in the automotive sector. The second issue, I think, second question, is related to that. So when will congestion on trans-Pacific shipping begin to clear? We've seen, again, a lot of commentary from the freight forwarding sector, including UPS, and also from the port operators, that they don't expect to see a clearance of current conditions and a return to normal, at least until the Lunar New Year, so in February of 2022. The reason for that is effectively we haven't had an off-peak shipping season this year. We've had effectively elevated demand that's rolled all the way through. It's very much been driven by this elevated demand that we've talked about. It's also been driven by a lot of those problems that I mentioned earlier in terms of the way that the shipping industry has been operating recently. The peak season then arrives. So all of the goods that are now shipping out of Asia and heading off to Europe and to the US East and West coasts, and those typically arrive from kind of August through November. And again, that's going to be elevated. And it's only really after that that we may begin to see something of a normalization. And that's probably why we're seeing so much in a way of elevated shipping rates at the moment. And our colleagues at S&P Global Platts have certainly indicated that there's another round of rate increases coming through. Surcharges are going to remain in place. And I think, interestingly, that is drawing governments to intervene as well. Final question, perhaps very quickly before we wrap. Will supply chain inflation persist? I think the short answer there is yes. We're continuing to see high prices for a lot of supply chain products for shipping, as I just mentioned. And it is worth mentioning that there will be a bow wave effect. So the elevated commodity costs now are becoming component cost increases during the third quarter. And we're beginning to see commentary from a lot of companies during the current earnings season that they'll be pushing up their prices during the third quarter and the fourth quarter. And that's everyone from toy makers to paint makers are talking about those price increases. So, inflation, I think, is going to roll on, at least from a supply chain perspective, for a little while yet. So thank you for your questions. We're going to move on now to the breakout sessions. If you have other questions, by the way, we'll try and get back to you on those. But we're going to move to the breakout sessions now. You're going to be directed to a landing page to choose the breakout session to join. The topics available to you. Track 1 is alternative data uses for unique insights. I'm excited to see that. Obviously, supply chain data is one form of alternative data. And that's going to be with Andreas Darmelin, our director and quant specialist, and Melvin Tan, who's in product management in our data management solutions business. The second track is making smart credit decisions with new insights and new technology. That's going to be run by Prerna Divecha, our product specialist for credit risk solutions. So please stay with us for one of those sessions, and thanks very much for listening. Goodbye now.